it's my pleasure to welcome David Parker, the Executive Director of West Australian Minerals Council of Australia. So David is based in Melbourne, or has been based in Melbourne, the Pilbara and now Perth. He's currently with the Minerals Council of Australia and he's, as I said, responsible for their activities across West Australia. So please join me in welcoming David to the thing.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. So that's my thank you. Well, thanks, Terry, and thank you, Karen. I feel like the job's been done. You've presented a very comprehensive case. But good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honour to be here and presenting at your LIVEX conference. And hopefully, with the after-lunch shift, I energise you and I give you something positive to take back in this increasingly very negative world we live in. But the topic of my discussion today is building Australia's prosperity together. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, we're living at a moment in time. We're living at the most complicated of times, but some of the most opportunistic of times, if we so choose to seek it out. And that social contract and that social compact with the Australian community is going to require leadership, determination, and really reinforcing that issue of national resilience. So let's get started. Minerals Council of Australia, we're basically the national shop front of the Australian mining industry. Headquarters is placed in Canberra, which of course is the national seat of government. We very much represent the length and breadth of the Australian mining industry, so think about gold, think about uranium, think about nickel, think about iron ore, think about coal. It all comes into the Minerals Council shop. There, the various views get ventilated. We crystallise what the high points of those arguments are and take them into our national parliament and into our public debates through the national media and national events and national conferences and symposiums like we're doing today. But I'm based in the outpost of Western Australia, which has half of a nation's mining activity going on in it, and most of half of the nation's mining exports, but well supported by the team in Canberra. And we're well supported with the State Chamber, who manages a relationship and looks after a relationship with the Government of Western Australia and our important regional governments and regional local governments across the length and breadth of Western Australia. So just having a look at some of the numbers, they're big numbers, they're significant numbers, and without those numbers and industries like yours, Australia really struggles to put food on the table. The royalty numbers of $395 billion pay a lot of the nation's bills in terms of our social infrastructure. Think of the PBS. Everyone wants a new medicine on the PBS. It's got to come from somewhere. So there's not too many mines in Canberra or Perth. These come from regional Australia. So this is where this regional prosperity theme starts to come through. The $27 billion in exploration. Exploration doesn't happen in the main streets or the suburbs of our capital cities. It operates and is active in some of the most remote and hostile parts of the Commonwealth. So this is value being extracted from our national geological inventory. And importantly, that export earnings of $2.9 trillion, really underpins our trading state as a nation. If Australia doesn't trade, the Australian people don't eat. This trading status of our nation is absolutely mission critical to our future. And just this week, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was quite staggering. There was a revelation within Treasury that gold had overtaken coal as Australia's second largest export. Gold. And why is gold significant? Because Western Australia produces 3/4 of a nation's gold and basically around the gold capital of Australia, Kalgoorlie-Boulder. And this had sort of been slipped by the Treasury people, and it's quite staggering just how the Australian resource economy keeps delivering this bounty to the Australian community and how we have to keep reinforcing and telling our story that this is what's happening. This is a lived experience of the Australian resource economic contribution to our national economic well-being. The investment outlook, that's another story, but importantly that workforce of around about 300,000 Australian people. And of course, with every one direct employee in our industry, there's a tail of about 5 people. The butcher, the baker, importantly the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker who support all those industries. The catering industries, the aviation industries, the fuel and logistics people, all depend on that one person who's at the direct employment of the industry. And I think when you look at the range and scope of those careers, There's something for everyone in the Australian mining industry. There's field work, there's semi-skilled work, there's technical roles, there's scientific roles, there's catering roles, there's social practice roles. So it is quite a wide range of professional careers and professional trade opportunities at well-remunerated salaries which flow back into the regional Australian community. And I think the other part of our story is the one that this is a big national regional story. We've got about 300 operating mines across Australia, and each of these mines contribute to Australia's global leadership in these key key commodity markets. So we're not a one-trick pony like some countries which only produce one particular commodity. We've got a basket of commodities. We're number 3 in gold production, we're number 5 in coal production, we're number 1 in iron ore production, and we're number 8 in copper production. So this is globally significant to the world's economy. If something happens into Australia, global supply chains feel it very, very quickly. So as part of our brief, we talk about how do we actually keep moving the agenda forward. What do we need to do as an Australian industry with our government partners and community partners to say how do we keep this story moving forward? How do we keep the needle moving in a positive direction? Well, we have a discussion about regulatory burden. And this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, you'll be aware that the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act amendments are going through the National Parliament. So here is an example of where the mining industry and its kindred industries like agriculture have got to stand up and say, Minister, Parliament, with due respect, we think it could be done this way and that way, and we will be able to keep delivering the economic output you're seeking from us. We look at things like delivering efficient public infrastructure. In today's media, you would have read about the power issues in Kalgoorlie affecting the mineral processing industries. Well, those power issues don't only impact on the mineral processing and extractive industries. Guess what? They impact on all the regional businesses in that goldfields area. When I was there last week, they were telling about the supermarket. The supermarket had to dispose, or the supermarkets had to dispose of all their frozen goods. No power for 4 days during last summer. That is a real issue. I mean, power is an expectation of a first world economy. And the last time I looked, Kalgoorlie was a very important part of our economy, and the fact we don't get the power piece right reflects very poorly on our system and our infrastructure system. So just by way of example, how do we as a community deliver efficient infrastructure to support our economic activities and our regional communities? We look at things like leveraging our opportunities. How do we manage our remote workforce to engage with our Indigenous communities? So there's a whole range of opportunities. So we looked at about 14 headline issues in terms of how Australia can play a substantive role in the global clean energy transition and reap these benefits to the broader community or broader economy. So anyhow, we do what we can to do in terms of articulating those views and providing rationale and recommendations to improve industrial policy. Industrial policy, industry makes Australia. Industry pays Australia's bills. So how we iron out these wrinkles and these imperfect situations is very much part of our MCA mission. So when we come to the issue of communities, now every day we're intersecting with our host communities. We are guests in those communities. We are at that community's acceptance or non-acceptance. So it very much is a people business. How your people intersect with those host communities is mission critical to the long-term success of your operation and business in that area. Respect, ensuring benefits are flowing through, and making sure that social performance is valued and is organised and recognised across your business units. And of course, the very important issue of managing and working closely with your host community, Indigenous communities. We then talk about local content. Local content is, in many cases, embodied in a lot of the agreements of mining activities across, particularly places like Western Australia. We have a very unique bespoke instrument called a State Agreement Act process in Western Australia, which basically was the basis of unlocking a lot of the iron ore wealth in Western Australia in the 1960s. And as part of those state agreements, there's local content components to those state agreements. So many years ago, when one of our founding leaders of modern Western Australia, Sir Charles Courts, set up these state agreements and brought the Japanese investment in a very difficult post-war environment, he said, I want to make sure these benefits flow through to the great people of Western Australia. And I want an area like Welshpool to reflect this economic empowerment and economic involvement of the West Australian small business community on this major capital investment. So 60 years later, you look at these places like Welshpool, you look at these places like Malaga, you go to Kalgoorlie, the light industrial areas, they are just booming. So that's a really good success of how the local content and the local industry participation can actually benefit from this very, very substantive, heavy capital investment at the front. So then we'll talk a little bit more about Indigenous economic empowerment as we go through. So I just want to share with you just an example of some of our advertising, just to promote how we're getting our message across. So if I can just play that ad, please, Mr. AV Desk. Bit of volume. No volume. Oh well. I think you can see the subtitles.
There's more to
I think you
Australian
get the
mining.
message that this is just trying to promote. Oh, we've lost it. Oh well, we'll move on. Thank you. So anyhow, let's have a look at Indigenous partnerships. So many of us working in regional Australia work very closely with Aboriginal and Indigenous Australia. Things aren't easy in a lot of our regional towns at the moment, and this is where leadership and opportunity comes forward. So we've been working very closely to build those frameworks for deeper and enduring partnerships with our traditional owner communities. The partnerships are mutually respectful. Do we get it right all the time? Not all the time. Do we try to get it right? Absolutely. So at the moment, our Minerals Council member companies employ approximately 6,000 direct Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with an average salary of around about $158,000 per annum. The next part of this is the Indigenous procurement spend. Now, at the moment, trying to get Indigenous people into the supply chain has been very, very successful. So across Australia, there's about $5.83 billion of business now being managed by Indigenous business enterprises. I think that's a remarkable achievement. That's across the whole Australian economy. So that's industries like yours, banking, construction, mining. Mining accounts for about 28% of that, or $1.64 billion of procurement activities. So that's great. That's getting Indigenous businesses into what can be quite complex mining industry supply chains. But earlier this month, one of my colleagues was in Darwin, and he flagged a new concept, which is Indigenous equity frameworks. So this builds on the actual procurement piece of direct employment and direct Aboriginal businesses engaging with the mining supply chain. Now this is Indigenous ownership and equity in Australian mining operations. So what he flagged is exploration and tenement holdings and getting actively involved in own-led exploration and tenement processes and co-investing in mineral processing and related infrastructure. So this is quite transformational, and this builds this Indigenous chain of involvement and supply into our Australian extractive and mining industry. So very exciting times ahead, and something which I think we will hear more of as we go into the future. In terms of alliances and partnerships, building part of this trust is working in partners in common. So at the moment, we've got an issue emerging, and it's been emerging for the last 30 years, of a lack of understanding of the old diesel fuel rebate, i.e. a refund for a tax which shouldn't be paid because you're using the diesel off-road. It's a pretty fundamental, straightforward policy as far as I can see. If you don't use the road, you don't pay the excise. Anyhow, there's a whole view and a whole campaign being prepared. No, we've got to have this as a subsidy, and this subsidy it's not a subsidy. So we've got to align with whole kindred interests across our regional communities, our remote communities, our kindred industries, of which the agricultural industry is a very proud member of that through institutions like the National Farmers Federation, to remind the policy thinkers and the policy think tanks and the policy makers in the national capital that this would be quite detrimental to our economic and regional sustainability. I mean, think if the diesel fuel rebate or the fuel tax credit was removed from a lot of Aboriginal communities, the cost of power would double in terms of those diesel fuel tanks. In terms of mineral processing activities, remote power operations, I mean, seafood industry, offshore vessels, the list goes on and on and on. The other part locally, we work very closely with a lot of our partner organisations, things like the Mining Club, the Energy Club, the Gold Industry Group. last or 2 weeks ago, we had the Mining Club lunch across at the Optus Stadium, about 700 small to medium-sized enterprises, all listening to the direction from one of the chief executives of one of the West Australian mining companies, explaining the high points and low points of the lithium industry. For those small to medium-sized business owners to go back to their staff and go back to their various stakeholders and explain, they'd heard it from the horse's mouth, they understood what the key issues were, the competitive issues, the labour market issues, the regulatory issues. It empowers people. So you bring people into the tent, you share your good stories and your bad stories, you empower them with that information, and it arms them with those sort of facts and figures. They can go back to their host communities and to their employees and to their various stakeholder groups and the highways and byways of the state and explain what their interpretation of the industry issues are. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a reasonably rapid walk through the mineral industry space at the moment, but we've really got to promote and address our issues. And I think what Karen said, the more you can actually get out there and tell your story, not be defensive about it, but be proactive about it, have those conversations, talk to people, make sure you're listening at the same time, we can actually move this national development needle forward. And I think one of the things which has come out of recent discussions with the critical minerals agenda, institutions like Geoscience Australia have identified Northern Australian economic opportunity as somewhere between about $3 and $5 trillion. Now that's agriculture and mineral development north of the Tropic of Capricorn. This is an enormous endowment for future generations of Australia. Critical minerals, minerals we haven't even heard of today, northern ports, northern towns, northern communities, Indigenous communities across our north, engaging with one of the most ferociously competitive areas of the world known as North and Southeast Asia. Unlocking Northern Australia for our next generation should be a national imperative, and I would really believe that industries like mining and agriculture and our transport industries will go a long way to securing Australia's future for our next generation, providing the economy, providing the sustainability and providing the national security and resilience we need to drive this nation's future forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the mining industry story. I hope you found it interesting. It's a great privilege to be here. It's a great privilege to share our story and our journey with the agricultural and the LIVEX community. And just before concluding, I will try that final slide, if I may, our final ad which we ran about 18 months ago, if I can, Terry. Was that going to work this time? Yep.
Australian minerals companies paid over $74 billion in taxes and royalties in 1 year alone, helping fund infrastructure and services. That's why every Australian has a stake in Australian minerals. Authorised by T Constable, Minerals Council of Australia, Canberra.
And therein lies the lesson. Thank you. Thanks, Terry.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, I think you've heard a very succinct outline of how the mineral industry tackle this problem of sentiment and the way that the industry is organised. So thank you very much for that. Yeah. Is there some questions? One right in the front here, please.
Thanks very much, David. Interesting presentation about the WA mining industry. I've just noticed the last ad that you played, it's very much about demonstrating to the Australian public the importance of mining to the economy, to their jobs, to who they are. Would you recommend that Australian agriculture should be doing the same sort of advertising?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think advertising by itself has got to be joined up with other activities. I think you've got to have the on-ground experience, you've got to have the lived experience, and then it's got to be topped and tailed with a very sharp, punchy advertising campaign. Remember, this is a very complex society we're growing up in now. Someone was telling me the statistics the other day, 225 people in the National Parliament, probably a few more have crept in since that stat, of which about 8 senators and federal members live in Northern Australia, 8. So we've got a job ahead of us. I mean, that's Northern Australia, that's not all of regional Australia, but I think it's just synonymous of just how detached the regional economic story is from mainstream southeastern Australia. And I think just by the advertising campaign, with the incursion programs, with the delegations to Canberra, with the schools program, it's like dripping water on a stone. You just got to keep it going, all joined up together in different messages to different markets, but regular messages to different markets at regular times. Yes, thank you. Good question.
Thanks. question?
Trevor Whittington, W Farmers. David, great presentation. Can you just comment briefly on the risks to Australia's primary industries of the federal government's changes to the Environmental Protection Act?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. Look, EPBC was a Liberal Party policy back in the day, 1999. Robert Hill brought it into the Parliament. It's been a very important piece of legislation and very important piece of regulation in terms of how major projects get approved. What we've seen over the last 25 years is that about 5 years ago, Graham Samuels suggested that this was now out of date and it needed to be upgraded to meet the contemporary needs of the Australian society and Australian business community, etc. The Minerals Council, along with a number of other kindred industry groups, have gone through and said it's important that this legislation go through, but with some very significant concession, or very significant changes. So last week, or a week ago, or 2 weeks ago, a statement came out with 7 amendments, which industry said the broad Australian industry group wanted to have these 7 amendments go through and sought the support of a coalition to go through with those amendments. As I understand it today, there's some media speculation that government's trying to push that through with the support of the Greens. That would be very unhelpful. I don't think that would be helpful for the Australian industry bloc. You know, it doesn't matter whether agriculture or mining or whatever. We've got to have sensible regulation which meets the needs and aspirations of the Australian community, but at the same time to make sure that we are still that capital competitive environment for international capital to come into Australia. And it's not only mining, it's housing. I mean, at the moment, what's the biggest threat to Australia's economic development is housing, lack thereof. So you don't want to have a restrictive environment policy which stops us building houses. So one arm's got to know what the other arm's doing. So, Trevor, I suppose in a nutshell, that EPBC regulation, or that EPBC legislation going through, it's very important to get it right, to make sure it goes through in a timely way, because once you have those laws go through, the laws are very difficult to change. So if there was a deal being done with the Greens or parties who weren't understanding of industry, I don't think that would be a very helpful outcome at all. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Trevor. Well, thank you, David, once again, and please join with me in thanking for that very good presentation. Good story.